One adaptation subject that interests me is when an ongoing series has an adaptation running alongside it, which adds or removes certain details, causing problems in the adaptation of a later installment. Stars. One of the best known examples of this almost happening is in the Harry Potter films. The story goes that Creature the House Elf was almost left out of the Order of the Phoenix film, but J.K. Simmons vetoed this, letting the filmmakers know that he had plans for the character to have a more significant role in Book 7, and so they kept the character in the film. Otherwise, they'd have had to have him appear out of nowhere and suddenly be important, or he'd have to be replaced by another character, and that brings its own set of problems. But this video is specifically about examples of new details being contradicted later, using the S.D. Perry Resident Evil novels as the focus. Stephanie Danielle Perry began her 7-book series with The Umbrella Conspiracy, an adaptation of the first game released in 1998. This was the same year the second game released, allowing her to incorporate details from that game, such as the RPD Stars office and Chief Irons. She continued to write both adaptations and original stories while the early games were still being made. Being 200+ page books, Perry added a lot of details to help flesh out the world while the game universe was still in its infancy and had little to draw on. Some of these would be contradicted by later games, which led to Perry having to find ways to justify the contradictions in her next adaptation. The Resident Evil 2 novelization, City of the Dead, follows the Leon A. Claire B scenario, which seems to have been considered canonical initially if Wesker's report using footage from it is any indication. The Umbrella Chronicles later confirmed that Claire A. Leon B was now canon, and this scenario was used in later retellings before the remake. Most of the differences between scenarios don't matter in the long run, but some of them did have long-reaching consequences. For instance, Sherry Birkin is infected with a G embryo only in Claire A, not Claire B. As such, she isn't infected in the book. This would have caused a problem for Resi 6 if Perry had ever made a Lord of the Rings length adaptation of that game, as Sherry is shown to have developed a Wolverine-esque healing factor as a direct result of that embryo. Some details aren't necessarily contradicted, but do lead to some head-scratching logic to get characters from their deviant paths back to where they are in the games for their next adventure. For instance, it's made clear in the first few novels that all of the surviving STARS members already left Raccoon City by the time of the outbreak, only for Resi 3 to reveal that Jill is still there. No mention is made to my recollection of Jill leaving and coming back in Nemesis, and this is the first book to include the author's note at the start that acknowledges that inconsistencies will happen. This is handled better in Code Veronica. Leon and Claire joined up with the Caliban Cove team at the end of City of the Dead and spent Underworld together, so Claire's raid on Umbrella Paris from the game is reworked into her getting caught out during a group mission before they were set to meet up with Chris. Leon being with Chris does allow Claire asking him to contact Chris make a lot more sense than in the game though. But back to the problems. Raccoon City's mayor, who goes unnamed in Resi 2, was named Devlin Harris in the book. In the third game, however, he was named Michael Warren, contradicting the novel. So when writing the novelization of Resi 3, Perry established that, in her canon, Warren is the mayor that preceded Harris. Now, that may work for a character who never shows up in either version, but how about an important OC? Throughout the book series, a character named Trent plays a recurring role, appearing or being mentioned in every installment, pulling the strings to suit his mysterious agenda. This character, whose existence was never intended by the devs at Capcom, inevitably caused continuity problems once his involvement became more significant. In the novelization of Code Veronica, it's revealed that Trent dragged Wesker out of the mansion in the first book, while the Umbrella Chronicles game established that Wesker instead took an experimental virus and dragged himself out of there. Still, this could be explained if Trent was Wesker's benefactor from around the 2003-4 period of the canon and make for only a small departure from the source material. However, Trent's parents, James and Helen, were revealed in the prior novel as top researchers in Umbrella who were killed by the company once James created the blueprint for what would become the series' various viruses. While there are similarities to Umbrella co-founder James Marcus, who was established a few years later in RE0, this is a very different backstory that's been heavily contradicted over the years. The novelization of Zero was the final book in Perry's series, incidentally. And it's an interesting piece because it marks the point where Perry just gave up on trying to combine faithfulness to the games and consistency with her books. Probably because RE0 cannot take place in the Perryverse. Resident Evil 0 starts and ends around 24 hours before Resi 1 starts and ends. In the Umbrella Conspiracy, however, Alpha Team heads out to find Bravo the same night, pretty much as soon as contact is lost, so there's absolutely no room for Rebecca and Billy's adventure. So how does the novelization of Zero approach the issue? It doesn't. It just adapts the game as is and includes none of Perry's original ideas from past novels. I have to wonder if Zero made Perry sick of trying to fit newer canon with her own and led to her just letting her contract not be renewed. I'd be interested to see how Perry might have adapted Umbrella's End or RE4-8. Sadly, we'll never see her take on that. Unless you live in Germany, because those releases group everything not based on the movies into one numerical series, making Rose Blank and To the Liberty, a pair of Japanese light novels, technically part of the Perryverse there. If you're at all interested in the books, they're not too difficult to track down, but it should be noted that the second printing from 2012 replaced the covers, which originally used a mix of concept art and original art, for new ones that just take renders from the newer games and slap them on a bland background. The Japanese covers look decent though. And one last thing before we go, I think the first book had some really good ways to adapt both scenarios, despite their overlapping moments, and to adapt some of the more awkward moments from the game. The 4 Alpha Team survivors arrive at the mansion together. They hear a gunshot and Chris goes to investigate. Instead of the hallway zombie, Chris finds the door directly across the hall from the dining room open and goes inside. It closes and locks behind him, trapping him with another zombie. He fires his gun, and that's the shot that sends Jill and Barry into their encounter with the proper first zombie. And another bit I like is when Barry saves Jill from being crushed and makes his famous Jill sandwich comment. We cut away right after he saves her, then cut back later to find him saying that line to try and lighten the mood while she's feeling sick and getting some fresh air. It's a bad joke and Jill treats it as such. And then Capcom went and made this characterization of Barry canonical with Revelations 2. It's possible someone at Capcom was familiar with the Perryverse when they decided to take Barry in that direction. So I think the Perryverse's legacy should be just a little more notable than Pat calling Caliban Cove bad and making fun of Claire's inner monologue in City of the Dead. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended channel is Beggy Beg Beg, which has a number of analysis videos on Devil May Cry, Onimusha, and Resident Evil, most notably the analyses of the Perry novels. Don't listen to Pat, give them a chance.